Welcome to a bonus lesson that's actually a bonus of a bonus. So we're kind of like bonus inception here. And what we're going to be doing is building off of what Joey just showed you about how you can use Cinema 4D to render out different passes and how to utilize them inside of After Effects to kind of build up things like shadows and reflections and have full control over them. There's actually so many things you can do to add more control over, say, 3D renders. And if you want to get into Cinema 4D, things that you need to keep in mind to have full flexibility so you're only rendering something once, rendering a scene once, and then be able to change things like motion blur or depth of field blur inside of After Effects using effects or third-party plugins. So this is very important. This is something that, again, is a thing, like Joey was saying. This is a thing that is very common when working in 3D and doing compositing. So we're going to be covering three specific things of utility passes, which is depth of field blur, motion blur, and something called normals. So normals is a thing that we'll describe, but it has so much power. It basically allows you to relight a scene inside of After Effects. So a whole 3D scene, you can actually relight it in After Effects. So really exciting stuff. Let's go ahead and jump in and discover these three new utility passes that we'll be using. Alright, so the name of the game is we always want to just render once out of Cinema 4D. It's kind of like measure twice, cut once. You want to check twice, render once. Alright, so what we're trying to aim for is the maximum flexibility when it comes to compositing inside of After Effects. Now, Joey showed you a whole bunch of ways we can render out different passes to have the most amount of flexibility when compositing in After Effects. But I'm going to show you a few more handy little things that will really allow you to push the limit of what you can do in post. You know, fix it in post. We're going to try to fix as much as we can in post if possible. Okay, so here's our multi-passes we had set up before in our creatures render setting here. So we got diffuse, specular, shadow, reflection, ambient occlusion, and your single object buffer. Now these are some of the most common multi-pass renders that you will make, but we can go a little bit further. Okay, so if we want to have maximum flexibility as far as motion blur in our scene, you know, we want to render out a separate pass that has all that information. And in Cinema 4D, in the multi-pass button here, we can go all the way down, and the thing that's going to render out the motion information or motion vector information to create motion blur in post is this motion vector pass. So we'll just add that to our multi-pass here. And one other thing while we're in here is we're going to go ahead and add a material normal. Now I'm sure you're wondering, what is a normal? Well, a normal is basically just the direction in which the surface or the face of a polygon is facing. So the polygons that are facing upwards will be assigned a certain color. The polygons facing left or right will have a certain color. And the faces or polygons facing the camera or facing away from the camera will have a different color. And they're actually represented in green, blue, and red. So if I click on one of my objects here, you'll see that up and down is the Y direction. That's color-coded green. So in our normals pass, any surface facing upwards or downwards will be assigned this green value. Same thing with X. Anything facing the right or left, any polygons facing the right or left will get the kind of reddish color, and anything facing towards our camera or away from the camera on the surface of these polygons. So right here, these middle polygons, they're facing us. They're facing us in Z space, so those will be color-coded blue. And we can use the green, red, and blue values to do some very cool kind of relighting techniques in post by just isolating those individual normal directions. Okay, so here's an example of what one of those looks like. You can see all those different colors. Green is kind of like more on the top side of the objects here, all our spheres, these little bubble characters. And then you can see the right, you're seeing a little bit of that red, and then Z, you know, facing forward is a little bit of blue. Now this will make a lot more sense once we break this out in After Effects, but this just is a very common technique. A lot of new compositors use this, but it just gives you like the full flexibility to kind of relight your entire object inside of After Effects, which is really, really cool. And it's not used a whole ton in After Effects. In fact, I kind of just learned about this, you know, just a little bit ago as well. But it's always about maximum flexibility. Okay, so we got our motion vector our material normals, and this is all good for this main creatures pass. And what we're going to do is, just like we rendered out the motion vector to apply the blur in post, because rendering blur in camera is very expensive as far as a render effect goes. Same thing goes for depth of field blur. So in our scene here, I'm just going to go to the top view of our scene, and here's our 3D camera tracker camera, and you can see that we activated the depth of field map rear blur. Now the name of the game here is you want to have like a full encapsulation of all the objects that are visible in your scene. So here are all of our little alien characters, and we made this depth of field rear blur big enough, far enough back in Z space that it's encapsulating all of these little aliens. And what this is going to allow us to do is render out a gradient from the beginning of our camera to all the way to this point, like a gradient ramp that is going to store all the depth information and give us depth values in values of luminance, or black or white. Okay, so we have that all set up. The only thing we actually need to do is add the depth pass to our render settings here. Now the depth pass, you need to do something a little bit special to render it out. With all of our other renders, we had some kind of anti-aliasing method in here because we wanted nice, smooth, blurred edges, so everything kind of seemed unified in our scene and seemed a little bit realistic. But with depth passes, we actually don't want any anti-aliasing at all. We actually want all of the aliasing. We want super sharp, crisp edges, because if you don't have those crisp edges and they're a little bit blurred, the depth pass will kind of not know where the front of an object is in front of another one if those edges are blurred. Okay, so we'll see this way better when we actually render this out, but the name of the game is you don't want those blurred edges when dealing with depth. We want aliasing, all of the aliasing. So what we're going to do is we have this render setting for our creatures with a little bit of anti-aliasing because we want smooth edges. So what we're going to go ahead and do is create our depth pass to have its own render setting, because we need that very specific render with aliasing turned on. Okay, so let's go ahead, go to our render settings button and just add a new render setting. I'm going to double click here and let's just name this depth, and now we can go into our anti-aliasing and turn that to none. Alright, so now we just have to go into our multipass, go to multipass button and go all the way down to depth, and there we go, and we can go to save and just uncheck our regular image, and we can go ahead and set up our OpenEXR and save this to whatever file folder we want. So this is going to contain our depth pass with the anti-aliasing set to none. And what we can do is go ahead and just create a whole new take that's going to just render out this depth pass. So what I'll do is just go and create a new take and rename this depth. And then I'll go ahead to this little setting here to say, okay, when I use this depth take, use the depth render setting here. So we have our ground passes that is using the ground render setting, the creatures take, which is using the creature setting. So when we're ready to go to render, all we need to do is go to render, render all takes to picture viewer, and it will render out the creatures pass, the ground pass, and the depth pass all at once. We don't need to set up multiple renders, which is really great. And I'll go ahead, and since we're using the physical renderer for all these other takes, I'll go ahead and make sure that I'm also in the physical render for this as well. Okay, so everything's looking good. We have our creatures pass that we added the motion vector to in the material normal. We have our very special depth pass, and we should be ready to go. And again, we can just render all these takes to picture viewer, or if you have everything else rendered out already, you could just go ahead and just render out just this depth pass. Okay, so once you go and render out all those things, we're going to import all of those passes into After Effects and start doing some compositing. Alrighty, so here we are in After Effects, and I imported our new passes. So I just re-imported our beauty pass with just the replace footage, or reload footage actually, and that will just update because we did add that motion vector pass and that normal pass, and that will all live in this new updated EXR. And then there's a separate depth pass that again we had to render out separately because we needed it to be aliased. Okay, so that's all that stuff. So let's go ahead and first start with our depth pass. So here we go. Let's just go ahead and drag and drop in our depth pass, and let's just hit enter and name this DOF. And if you see what's going on, it doesn't look like a depth pass at all. It just kind of looks like a really grainy thing. This is another example where we have to use the extractor effect to tease out and extract that depth pass using our magic. So here we go. Let's grab our magical extractor effect. And in the layers, if I just click, the only option is depth. So we'll do that. And there you go. That's all good. You don't need to change anything like that. And you'll see that here is our depth pass represented as black and white values, and you can see the closer to us, closer to the camera, the more gray the image gets. And actually this is a little bit offset, so let me just move this track down. So there we go, we can see what that looks like. So let me just move this forward. Actually, I'll move this further along so we have more of these little alien guys closer to the camera. You see, closer to the camera we have a little bit darker bit of gradient. Now, to kind of fix that there's no background in here, you can see everything kind of fades to white in the background. What we're going to do to just fill in the rest of this background with white is to just grab a good old solid composite. And there we go. Now we have, like, this is what a depth of field pass would originally look like if you rendered this out as like a PNG or something like that. Okay, so we have this black to white gradient. You can really see it's almost like fog, you know, which is really cool. And this is also, you know, something you could use to recreate, you know, kind of fog effects as well, where things are kind of further to the background there, which is really cool. So let's go ahead, and what we can do with this is we can even go into a levels effect and adjust it and have even more control here. So maybe we want to crush the levels here or do whatever we want, and you know, really have a lot of full control as far as what our depth pass looks like, something like that. So we're doing all these levels and things, and let's actually see what this looks like when we apply this to our depth of field. So what I want to do is just turn off this layer so it has all its effects applied and all that stuff. And what we need to do to add that depth of field blur to our beauty pass comp is to go into our effects and go into blur and sharpen, and we're going to use the built-in camera lens blur. Okay, so that's applied to our beauty pass. Now in this plugin, or in this effect, we are going to define the blur map layer, and that's that depth of field with all the extractor and solid composite and levels, all those effects applied. So to get that to work here, we are going to choose that layer, which is that DOF, and we're going to make one important change is we applied effects to that layer. So in order for this camera lens blur effect to recognize all those effects that we applied, we need to change this from source to effects. Okay, and you'll see that something kind of updated here. We're getting a little bit of blurriness back there. And if I go ahead and just crank up these values, you can see that we're getting this little fringe here, and that's just because we need to turn on that repeat edge pixel. So just kind of like you know, other type of grain effects, sometimes you need to turn that on to continue that effect to the edges of our composition here. But one thing you're going to notice is that just by default, everything that's closer to the camera, or in our case, anything that has that darker gray value, is going to be more in focus, and everything in white, to the white part of this gradient, is going to be very blurred out. Okay, so gray values, less blur, white values, fully blurred. Okay, so what we can do is actually flip that and reverse it by checking on this invert blur map. Now we kind of flipped it where everything that's close to the camera, gray, is going to get blurred, and everything further away is going to be in focus. So this could be a really cool effect that, you know, as these little blobby guys come towards the camera, they get really blurred. Okay, so we're going to mess around with this. We can also crank this up and even go into our depth of field pass and play around with these levels. And depending on, you know, if we, you know, play around with the gamma and stuff like that, that can totally change things. We can adjust these little levels here, and you can see that we're kind of totally changing how this looks. Like, check out like the fringes here. We're really changing how this effect is being applied along the expanse of our scene here. So this is the power and flexibility of rendering out a depth pass and applying that blur after the fact using an effect. So we can totally change like where our focus is and stuff like that, and this is really, really cool. Okay, so there is our depth of field. So let's go back into our beauty pass. Maybe we'll bring this down to a more subtle amount, so maybe 10, so it's just a very subtle thing. I think that's looking good. And again, we can always go back into our levels and, tweak this to our heart's content, but I'm liking that subtle nature of that lens blur. Next, we can add our second type of blur, which is our motion blur. Okay, so that motion blur pass, that motion vector pass, is going to live in this beauty pass. Okay, so I'm just going to drag and drop this beauty pass into my composition here, and let's just move this layer down. So there it is, and you're not going to see anything yet because, again, we have to extract. Again, do our little magician stuff, and let's just rename this motion blur. Let's just do Mo Blur because that's fun. Mo Blur. So we got Mo Blur here, and we need to again use that extractor plugin. So 3D channel extractor, and we're going to go into our layers, and boom, there is our motion vector that we re-rendered out. So there that is, and all this is good to go. Now, we had the black and white kind of gradient that represented the depth. Here we have green and red to kind of determine where the object's moving and how fast. So fast up or down and how fast horizontally. So if we go ahead and we see this green's really close to the camera, let's turn off this motion blur layer and let's apply the motion blur effect. Now, the motion blur effect that I'm going to be using is from Revision plugins. It's kind of like the standard plugin that, as far as all the 3D artists that I know are using this, it's a Real Smart Motion Blur. And just an alternative for the camera lens blur, there's also a plugin called Frisch Luft Depth of Field. So it's another third-party plugin if you want to play around with that. There's also a bokeh blur on AE Scripts that just came out, somewhat recently. So there's a lot of different alternatives out there. We'll have links that you can check out as well. But really, you can play around and get different effects with all different types of blurs, but Revision Real Smart Motion Blur is a staple and has been for quite a long time for 3D artists that want to composite inside of After Effects. So Real Smart Motion Blur, there's two versions. They're both pretty inexpensive, and again, we're going to have links provided to all of these plugins, but one thing you need to know about the Real Smart Motion Blur is there's the basic version and the pro version. Now, the basic version is not going to use our motion vector pass. What it's going to do is do its best guess as trying to figure out where your objects are moving by kind of guesstimating by, pixel to pixel, frame by frame, where the pixels are moving from one frame to the other. 90% of the time, this works really, really good. But for our case, we're going to use the Pro version, and the Pro version is the actual version that uses motion vectors. And since we're all pros here, that's what we're going to use today. So let's go ahead and use the Real Smart Motion Blur Pro Vectors. Say that 5 times fast. We're going to apply that, and everything's going to turn red. Okay, so one thing we need to do is, just like our camera lens blur, we need to define that blur layer. So let's go and just grab our Mo Blur layer, and there you go. We have some blur applied. Now, it's pretty blurry right now, and basically if I go ahead and turn on, you can see it's just way too blurry. Like, these things aren't moving that fast. Now, if I go ahead and turn on my motion blur source layer here, you're going to see the kind of color coding here again, green to yellow. And if we break this down, what's actually going on is, just like in an axis in Cinema 4D, everything's going to be kind of either green for up and down movement or red for kind of horizontal movement. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of up and down movement here because what we're seeing is a lot of green. So if we go into our info panel, basically what the motion pass has in terms of green and red values are the strength of up and down movement and left and right movement, and those are represented as the R and G channels here. Okay, but if I go into just my green channel here, you're going to see that basically what these values mean, the 23% and 33% we have over there, what those values mean is basically whatever's 50% of a gray value, either green or red, is going to be zero motion. So no motion is 50% of that gray, or 50% green, or 50% red. And everything below 50% is going to be moving to the left, and everything above 50% is going to be moving to the right, and similar up or down if you're going below 50 or above that 50%. Now, you're going to see that all these values are fairly high, and there's like no stationary values here. Like typically you would think like, okay, this object right here is really not moving at all, okay, but they still have such high values here. So, you know, depending if we're reading this through the red and green values here and the green channel here, you're seeing that that green value is 22%. So that means that it's moving down at a fairly high pace, and that's why we're getting all that blur. One thing you need to know, and it's just something really technical, and you know, we're going a little bit down the rabbit hole as far as, you know, how After Effects handles motion vector passes, is they actually bring them in wrong. So After Effects color management is not great as far as the motion vector pass. So to make this more accurate and to kind of prevent this really heavy blurring that we have going on here, we're going to need to do a little bit of color management here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our effects, and we're just going to look for the color profile converter. Okay. Now the problem that we're running into is that we rendered these passes using linear working space inside of Cinema 4D, and for some reason, as far as motion vectors go, that does not carry over. That linearized input profile does not carry over. So we have to add this color profile converter, kind of brute force After Effects to realize that, hey, this is a linearized workspace, or you know, linearized image that we're bringing in here. So what we're going to do is just a couple things. We're just going to check on this linearized input profile, and then for the output profile, we're just going to go to sRGB, and you're going to see that everything got much more bright here. Now if I go to my info panel here, you're going to see that these values are much closer, the R and G values are much closer to that 50%, which is right about where you'd want. So the R and G values up here, the R is, you know, about 45, and G is like 51.5%. So what that means is these values are very close to that 50%. That means that there's very little movement, or zero movement if it's just directly 50%. Okay, so these are more corrected and accurate values that we're getting here. So again, just a little hitch as far as needing to get that color profile converter going. And then what we need to do again is go to our beauty pass here that we have our Pro Vectors applied to, and again change this Moblur from source to effects and mask, because again we want to take into account that color, that profile converter. Okay, so if we turn off this Moblur layer, you're going to see that the blurring is actually way more subtle than it was before, but it's still a bit much. So what we can do is there's a very specific instruction on the Real Smart Motion Blur website that if you're using a 32-bit floating image like we are now, we need to change this max displace from its default of 64 to 2048, and you're going to see that perfect, great, that's exactly what we want. You're going to see that we're going to get a lot more range of values as far as the motion blur goes, but it's also going to be a little bit more sensitive here. So we have a lot more values and levels of accurate motion blur, but this blur amount is just way too high. So what we're going to do is maybe give it a value of like 0.1, and you're going to see that we're getting way less blurring, and it's very subtle, and I think that's looking pretty good. But now we can go, you know, back and forth here and see that, okay, maybe we go back to right when the creature activates right here, and you're seeing all this is the most amount of motion that we're getting here. And if we just kind of go a few frames down and see what's going on, we got all this good motion blur movement there. And again, just a little bit of detail goes a long way. So if I go ahead and turn off both the camera lens blur and Pro Vectors, you can see that just a subtle amount of blur is going on here, and that's what is causing the imperfection, and that is what's going to help us sell this shot and sell the melding of this little alien into this real footage here. Okay, so a little bit of imperfection goes a long way. So those are your blurs. Now let's go ahead and utilize that material normals path. So for that, let's go ahead and jump into our beauty pass. And this is a good little scene right here. Maybe we'll just go to right here so we can see more of these little guys. And what we're going to do is we are going to add in, again, another beauty pass. Okay, so there's our beauty. It's very beauteous. And what I'm going to do is rename this normals. And what I want to do is, we have the light coming from the sky here, which is typically where light from the sky comes from, right? Unless you're upside down on the moon or something, I don't know. But what we're going to want to have is, maybe brightening up the tops of our little objects, our little aliens here. They are aliens, so maybe they're on an alien planet where the sky is below. I don't know. Or to the right or to the left. So let's actually just go ahead, and what I'll do is, we want the normals that are facing upwards, in the Y direction and in bottom, to have that kind of the highlight. We want to take that information and use that almost as like a lumimat, and use that to brighten up and get a little highlight on the top of our objects here. So what I'm going to rename this is just normal and just Y direction. Okay, so just normals in the Y direction. And what I'm going to do is, again, grab our extractor, and we are going to grab our material normal. Okay, so now you can see what this normal pass looks like in context here. So again, I was saying that if you look at the axis arrows in Cinema 4D, up is color-coded green for Y. So that's what we want to take. So if we look at this, we have all these different channels. And we know we want to be using the green channel because that is the color that are the normals facing upward. You can see the top of this object right here, all the polygons, all the surfaces that are facing upward, they're all green. So if we change the red and blue layers or channels to normal green and normal green, you can see that this is what we get at the bottom of our scene. It's almost like this is like a mask, like something's being lit from above, and this is the result. Okay, so what we can do now is again use levels and really crunch this, maybe this way, and so we just get a little bit of a highlight on the top of all of these spheres and on the top of this object. And then what we can do is adjust this or use this as a lumimat here. Okay, so let's go and just create a new solid, and let's make it a just normal white solid. So we'll go there, hit OK. But if I go and use this white solid and use that normal's direction as a lumimat, you can see what we're left with is just these little highlights. Okay, and now what we can do is change this white solid to add, and hit T for opacity, and you can adjust this as like a little highlight. So we can, again, kind of relight our scene using these normal vectors. And this is just amazing, right? Like, you don't have to go and, re-render anything like that or change lights. Like, if we want a spotlight or overhead light kind of look for our object here, we can get that effect using our normals pass, or materials normals pass, which is really great. So we can adjust this however we want. Maybe just a little subtle thing like that. That's looking good. Maybe adjust the gamma, or just adjust the opacity here. And you can turn this on and off and just see how much of a difference that makes. It looks really, really nice. Maybe we want to add a little bit of, say, yellow or maybe even blue to this hue too as well, just so this kind of fits with the scene. I'm thinking maybe yellow might fit a little bit better, just a little bit of subtle yellow. So something like that. I think that's looking really nice. I think that fits in the scene a little bit better. But this is huge. So let's just see what this looks like if we change all of these to the red. Now remember, red is the x-axis, so going horizontal. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. So let's go to red, red, and red. So check that out. Now the light, if we were lighting this, it's almost like a side light coming from the right hue, which is really, really cool. How awesome is that? Now we can go ahead and even invert this. So let's go to invert, and let's reset the levels here, but maybe bring it to the right. And you can see that now we're kind of getting lit from the left side here. So a lot of flexibility as far as this goes with the normals pass, with, relighting your scene, just completely using the normals here. Okay, so let's reset this. I just want this lit from the top. So let's go and go back to our green. So green, green, and green. Oh, actually, I did motion vector. Don't want to do motion vector. Let's go to material normal. It's easy to screw that up. So here we go. Just material normal green. You can see all these different channels. You have motion vector blue, green, red, shadow blue, green, red, ambient occlusion. So you want to make sure we're doing the material normal green, and there is our nice little highlight. All right, so there you go. You can hopefully see how important it is to understand how impactful passes are as far as what you're rendering out of Cinema 4D, okay? And just how much more flexibility you have adding your own motion blur and controlling that in After Effects versus rendering it out. Again, these blur effects and even relighting effects can be very render intensive. So there's no reason why you should be rendering out these blurs in 3D when when you render them out of Cinema 4D, that's baked in. If you want to change the amount of blur, guess what? You got to re-render that whole thing all over again. Now, with the advent of third-party renderers like Octane and Redshift, this is becoming less of an issue because of the GPU power that you can now throw behind some of these renders. And they do render these effects like blurs and highlights and all kinds of stuff like that incredibly fast. But again, if you render out all that stuff and those blurs are all baked in, you have to re-render that whole thing. And even though these third-party renders render really fast, you're wasting a lot of time. Meanwhile, if you just render it out as a separate pass, you could just change a value in here. Maybe the client wants a lot of motion blur, like they want to go crazy. So you just change a value and re-render in After Effects, and it's going to be a lot faster than rendering in 3D. So again, passes, it's something that's a little bit difficult to wrap your head around, but hopefully you understand how powerful they are and how much flexibility they offer in your composite.